Okay, if you could take your seats, we'll get started with tonight. So my name is Philip Carter, and I'm from the Center for New American Security. Thank you, Karen, for convening this conference today and for inviting all of us to come talk with you. It's been a long day, and I'm cognizant of that. I'm also cognizant of the fact that this panel stands between you and drinks. Over the course of the day, we've talked about the legal case for drones and oversight thereof. We've debated the legal contours of the current U.S. armed conflict and its counterterrorism efforts. We've worked to understand the contours of the future cyber threat, which we now understand may render obsolete much of what we understand about the law of armed conflict and armed conflict itself. This panel is different, in large part because it focuses outward from this room on the world around us, and particularly what's happening in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and other fronts in U.S. counterterrorism efforts. I'm joined on the panel by a number of individuals whose full biographies are in your packets, but I do want to quickly go down the list because it's such an impressive group. I want to note up front, aside from myself, there are no attorneys on the panel. I think that's a good thing, and I also think it's going to inform the perspective of this panel, which is in many ways focused on what's happening in the real world and how do the dynamics we've talked about this morning and this afternoon play out in places like Afghanistan, Mali, Syria, and elsewhere. So I'm joined by Peter Bergen, journalist and director of the New America Foundation's National Security Program. To his left, your right, is David Barno, retired Army Lieutenant General and senior fellow with me at the Center for New American Security. To his left is Candace Rondeaux, a journalist and researcher in Brussels, formerly a senior analyst with the International Crisis Group in Afghanistan. To her left is Douglas Ollivant, retired U.S. Army officer, noted expert on counterinsurgency, Iraq and Afghanistan veteran, and also senior fellow at the New America Foundation. And finally, John Lee Anderson, journalist for The New Yorker, and most recently, field experience in Libya, Mali, Syria, and a number of other interesting places that he's going to talk about with us. So, starting with Peter, I was wondering if you could give us your perspective on Afghanistan, Pakistan, and sort of where to from here in those particular locations.
Thank you, Fordham and Karen, for the invitation. On Saturday, Pakistan celebrated an important milestone, which is the first time a civilian government in Pakistan's history has filled out its 5-year term. And I don't think that this development can be underestimated. As you know, one of the reasons that Pakistan, in a sense, has sort of been deformed is the overwhelming influence that Pakistani military has had on its foreign policy. And basically it's had a veto on all aspects of national security as it relates to India or Afghanistan. And while the civilian government that is going to be elected in May, which will be another 5 years, may not be the most popular group of people, judging by past civilian governments, it is a fact that having 10 years of uninterrupted civilian government is really going to change the equation in Pakistan in a very positive way, particularly, I think, in the long term for Afghanistan. And turning to Afghanistan, I also have some sort of relatively optimistic sort of projections. Few countries in the world have had life expectancy go up by 18 years in 1 decade, which has happened in Afghanistan. Life expectancy under the Taliban was 45. Now it's 62 for men and 64 for women. It took the United States from the turn of the century, the beginning of World War II, to having equivalent growth in life expectancy. For all the kind of concerns that the economy in Afghanistan is going to tank, which I think are quite legitimate, it's interesting that the World Bank has produced a massive and quite comprehensive and rigorous study suggesting that the GDP rate in Afghanistan is going to contract from 9% to 5%. And by way of contrast, of course, we've had a 2% growth rate for the past 4 years. And there's a whole raft of statistics I can give you about Afghanistan, about how life is different. I was there during the Civil War, I was there during the Taliban. You can see it with your own eyes. It was a country without a phone system. Now 1 in 2 Afghans have a cell phone. It was a country where there were no girls in school. Now 37% of the population of people in school are girls. There were about 1 million people in school at the time of the Taliban. Now there are 8 million. And there are multiple kinds of statistics like that I can give you. The most common polling question you can ask in any country is your country going in the right direction? A recent Rasmussen poll in this country found that 33% of Americans found that their country is going in the right direction. A massive Asia Foundation poll, 6,000 person sample, found that 52% of Afghans in fall of last year thought their country was going in the right direction. And there's a simple reason for that. Basically, their expectations about what the right direction looks like are much lower than ours. And so, you know, and one final point on Afghanistan. The spring 2014 election is a huge inflection point. If this is free and fair enough and reasonably uncontested, you know, Afghanistan is going to look a lot better going forward because the great concerns, I think the economic concerns will be sort of cleared up if the political concerns are cleared up, and the political concerns will be cleared up, and that will produce a better security situation. If on the other hand, it's an extremely flawed, contested election, you know, that could precipitate in something that Candace may well talk about, a kind of renewed round of civil conflict. So that is something that is within our control and within the Afghans' control. It's a very predictable political event. And there was a reasonably good election in 2004. There was a very flawed election in 2009. Hopefully there will be a good election again in 2014. And one final observation about Al-Qaeda. You know, Al-Qaeda central is going the way of the dodo. My expertise is Al-Qaeda. I feel like a psychologist in 1989. It's a good feeling. You know, look around the world, Jamal Islamiyah in Southeast Asia, Abu Sayyaf group in the Philippines. These groups are basically out of business. And even Al-Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb, people were talking about as though a threat. Well, they attacked an unprotected gas facility in the middle of the Algerian desert. This is not 9/11. They've been in existence for 7 years. They haven't even tried to plot an attack on the West. The only group with any real kind of strength left in that constellation is the Al-Nusra Front in Syria, which is sort of Al-Qaeda in Iraq by a different name, which is not making the same mistakes Al-Qaeda made in Iraq. And they are going to be a problem in Syria going forward. You may have this unusual situation where you have a Hezbollah-like militia that happens to be a Sunni fundamentalist movement that is actually providing services, because typically these groups don't provide services on the Sunni side. So that's on the Sunni side of the street, a more optimistic kind of projection, both on Al-Qaeda and Afghanistan.
And Dave, you commanded U.S. forces in Afghanistan, and you kept your finger on the pulse since then. What does your crystal ball say for the next year and a half, and then after U.S. forces complete their involvement at the end of 2014?
Well, thanks, Phil. I'll try and touch on what some of the options are for our troop numbers in particular, which is still somewhat undetermined, but also maybe sketch the bigger picture a little bit as well and look at how we should be thinking about, as Peter noted, not just Afghanistan, but Pakistan and the region, and what U.S. interests are there that need to be preserved after 2014. Well, let me start there, in fact, because I think the big picture is conducive to then thinking about what we do next. On the big picture, I think as the U.S. continues to transition out of Afghanistan and as we get into the final decision set, if you will, for what kind of presence we're going to have there or have it all there after 2014, that our policymakers really need to take into account, once again, maybe for the first time in a long time, what are the regional vital interests that the United States has to be able to continue to protect with whatever residual presence, whatever influence we have in Afghanistan and the region writ large after 2014. And I usually sketch those out in 2, perhaps 3 vital interests. These are ones that are absolutely essential to the United States, and if we fail to achieve at least this minimum after our transition in 2014, I think the last 10 years will have largely been a failure. The first is, an obvious one to this group, I think, clearly, to prevent further terrorist attacks on the United States or our allies that emanate from that part of the world. That's why we're in Afghanistan originally. That has become less clear in the recent years, I think, as Al-Qaeda has largely been dissipated, and the Taliban, that wasn't a direct participant in the 9/11 attacks, is still out there on the battlefield. So the vital interest of protecting the U.S. against terrorist attacks and our friends. Secondly, I think we have a vital interest in the region to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons or nuclear materials into the hands of hostile actors. And that has less to do with Afghanistan than perhaps some of the neighbors, as you would expect. 2 of whom are nuclear armed, with a third aspiring to that status. Then the final one is, I think the U.S. has a vital interest in preventing a nuclear war in the subcontinent between India and Pakistan. Now, if we look at those 3 and we look at the role of Afghanistan in those, we probably come up with a bit different menu of options and probably a bit different set of priorities than Americans often arrive at when they think about what comes next in Afghanistan. In fact, the discussions on Afghanistan and the troop presence there, which is now coming down from about 66,000 at the end of last year. By this time next year, troop presence in Afghanistan will be about 32,000 Americans. And then by the end of 2014, it will come down to whatever the final number is in January 2015, which is not yet been determined. That long-term number, how many Americans stay at the end of this transition, is a big question in Washington right now. And it ranges from a high end, perhaps as many as 13 to 15,000 American troops. There's been reporting that General Mattis has suggested about 13,600 on his way out as the CENTCOM commander, and then another 5,000 or 6,000 NATO troops on top of that. So maybe a long-term number as many as 20,000 U.S. and NATO troops in Afghanistan, all the way down to a low end of 0, which is as low as it gets. 0 American forces, which was essentially the option that we arrived at in Iraq because we were unable to achieve an immunity agreement from Iraqi law, status of forces agreement that would protect American troops there from being prosecuted under local law. If we can't achieve a similar level of agreement for immunity in Afghanistan, then the number will be 0, because that's how we operate around the world. We don't have that immunity, we don't deploy troops there. So that's the range of options. As I had a chance to testify about 2 weeks ago in front of the House Armed Services Committee, I was somewhat surprised. I heard skepticism on both sides of the aisle about the commitment, about the long-term impact, but more subtly, as we look ahead 2 more years, whether the United States is going to be willing to write the checks for a sustained military presence in Afghanistan. The cost of that today is about $1 million per American soldier per year. That number will only increase slightly as the total number of soldiers go down. And so 10,000 Americans, $10 billion. 20,000 Americans, $20 billion a year. On top of that, another $6 billion for the Afghan security forces, roughly speaking, and perhaps several $billion in aid and development money beyond that. So the price tag of Afghanistan is not incidental in an American populace that's strapped right now economically, and in a Congress that's putting some pretty severe cuts in place for both domestic and defense discretionary spending. A $30 billion, $20 billion, $15 billion a year price tag for Afghanistan, the second poorest country in the world. 2 years from now, I'm having a hard time seeing how that's going to hold the test of time and be a supportable outcome. So, again, my estimation would be we're going to be on the low end of that number, and I think it's going to be driven by what our vital interests are, how much popular support can be sustained, and where the Congress fits on that funding equation as much as on the troop equation.
Thank you. And Candace, a lot of this hinges upon the role of the Afghan National Security Forces and their ability to carry the mantle of security from the U.S. and other NATO countries will move apart. What are their readiness? You have a piece in the packet that talks about the NDS and its particular challenges. Can you speak to the fragility or sustainability of the Afghan security forces and their ability to pick up this burden?
I think this might be one of the few instances where a general and a journalist might agree that the calibration of the policy in Afghanistan will depend very much on the finances, really. And I think that partners in particular, European partners in particular, right now are really tense because they're looking for the U.S. to start making some quick decisions because, of course, they're in a financial situation that's very tight. And I think the U.S. is very much relying on European partners to pony up advisors, trainers, equipment for the continued sustainment of the Afghan National Security Forces that will be critical to the overall sort of outlook past 2014. But nobody's going to budge until Obama and the White House make it very clear what their intent is overall. Now, how can they make that clear in a situation where they don't seem to have much control over the political environment domestically in Afghanistan? I mean, we see increasingly fracturing in the relationship between Washington and Kabul. And also in Kabul itself, there's additional fracturing occurring between the presidential palace, the parliament, even the judiciary. It's an extremely broken system. And I think one of the things that will determine the effectiveness of the ANSF is whether or not this fragmentation within the political institutions can be resolved in a timely manner. And the pressure, unfortunately, of the deadline, the 2014 deadline, has made this a bit tough, in so much as Karzai is looking at the clock, wondering how he can extend his mandate, even if only through a proxy, for protection of his own political interests and his own legacy, which are natural. And then, of course, those around him recognize that this is an opportunity for a really either dramatic change in the political structure of the country, or perhaps more of the same, status quo. I think many people are hoping that it won't be status quo because it's been a pretty abysmal status quo over the last 3 years. We've seen now an experimentation with counterinsurgency post-surge 2009 that I think is an abysmal failure. And I think that many Afghans believe it's an abysmal failure. There's been this narrative that the counterinsurgency campaign has sort of been sidetracked or derailed in some way by the lack of a credible partner in the presidential palace in Kabul. And I think that's probably true. I mean, we all know about the scandals at the Kabul Bank and the corruption and the billions of dollars stolen and the money leaving Kabul, the Kabul airport in suitcases and so forth. And I mean, that is part of the narrative, and it is an important part of the narrative. It certainly has affected the political prospects for the country. But I think the bigger part of the narrative that isn't talked about very often is the critical failure of our intelligence community in interpreting the situation on the ground. There has been so much focus on targeting the Taliban, chasing Al-Qaeda, that the militaries, the institutions, officials, have a very difficult time understanding the relationships within the security forces that affect their effectiveness, basically. So you have, 3 different major services: the Afghan National Army, the Afghan National Police, and the National Directorate of Security, which is the main intelligence agency in Afghanistan. They're deeply fragmented on an ethnic basis. They have old factional alliances, some of them stemming back to 1973. Many of them are still stuck in 1990, trying to resolve their conflicts over the coup that occurred in 1990. All of these things are playing out, not really behind closed doors, but behind a language barrier, behind a cultural barrier that unfortunately ISAF and American forces have been unable to surmount, mainly because they haven't actually mustered the political will to do so. And I think that's where now we're going to see rubber meeting the road. And since 2004, the United States has spent $28.5 billion on sustaining the Afghan National Security Forces. And we're looking at spending probably another $20 billion if we want to do this up through 2018 or so. It's a lot of money. And you've got to ask yourself, what are you getting in return for that investment? What you're getting right now is a force that's roughly the size of about 352,000 Army and police. Maybe 20% of whom are actually literate at the first grade level. Only 20% of them are actually showing up to the job. And the attrition rate has hovered around 30% consistently for the last 5 years. So how do you change that calculus? I think this will be the biggest challenge now going forward, from 2014 forward. How do you make this investment start paying off? And it's very possible that you can under the current circumstances.
So, Doug, you were one of the architects of the Iraq surge, both in Baghdad and on the NSC, and then senior counterinsurgency advisor in Afghanistan. What do you think?
I think I'm going to talk about Afghanistan briefly, and then let's try to move on to the next course because I'm tired of talking about Afghanistan. Very briefly, I think I mostly agree with Candace in the general on what our presence is going to look like. We're going to try to keep a small JSOC force there, a Joint Special Operations Task Force, mostly to go across the border into Pakistan at either Bagram or Jalalabad. In order to add a sweetener for the Afghan government so we can keep it there, we're going to have some advisors at the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Interior to work with the senior generals and give them a a mechanism to not only be advised, but to ask us for things. We'll then have the security, logistics, medical, and helicopter support to enable all this. And I suspect very, very little else. I suspect there's not going to be much appetite for anything beyond that. But I want to look beyond Afghanistan and Iraq for just a minute and just look at the future. I think we have a conventional wisdom about what the future security environment is going to look like. And we're going to have a global pursuit of terrorism led by drones and Black Ops, SEALs, Deltas, these kinds of people. We're going to fight a cyber terrorism fight, and then we're going to park a bunch of ships and planes in the South China Sea and you know, deter or do whatever we're going to do with China. And I just don't think that captures the security environment that we're going to be looking at in the next 20 years. A friend of mine, this is not for me, this is, I wish I'd thought of this, summed it up really succinctly. It's like, you know, is the problem we're really facing in the coming decades one of bad order, you know, an order that's working but that we don't like, or is it going to be disorder? Disorder coming from one of two places, either from existing states collapsing, as we're, for example, seeing in Syria, or from a state that just never existed, just bringing disorder, as we've had some experience with in Afghanistan. I think clearly we're going to deal much more with disorder than with bad order in the coming couple decades. But I don't think we like to think about that because we have Iraq fatigue and more Afghanistan fatigue, our generation's version of the Vietnam syndrome that's going to cause us not to look at these things. So we have a pendulum swing away from thinking about how are we going to use forces to deal with disorder. And I say with some regret that I suspect it's not until we have our next versions of Srebrenica and Rwanda that we're going to start thinking about how do we bring that pendulum back. I think we're in a position where politics plays deeply in this. I think in the Pentagon, in the Office of Secretary of Defense, we are adverse to even hypothesizing about scenarios in which we might need to stabilize collapsing states. These are not things that we're allowed to talk about inside the Pentagon, because that would bring us to conclusions that we just rather not think about, because we have very clear defense guidance that says we don't do these big interventions anymore. Interesting for this group, I think perversely, this is going to be really, really good for outsourcing. Because these problems are not going away. They're going to be there, and people who live there are going to have to deal with these problems. So if I were to project something that might want to be thought about by a center that does law and security, what this next decade is going to mean for the successor firms to Blackwater and Executive Outcomes, I would say those are probably a strong buy. And then finally, because of all the pressures about not thinking about these issues, I remain deeply concerned about how we maintain the hard lessons that we've learned in Iraq and Afghanistan, which cannot be summed up in words like just go surge. How do we maintain these lessons inside our institutions of government as these skills will quickly atrophy?
And that's a terrific opening for John Lee, who's both written about Iraq and Afghanistan, but also recently, literally the four corners of the earth, I think, certainly Libya, Mali, Syria, and other locations that are conflict affected. What's been your perspective on these places and U.S. actions and other actions there?
Thank you. Thank you all. I've been ruminating all day about what my thoughts are. And the fact is, I feel I still have the jury's still out. My mind isn't made up. And in general, I think that probably reflects much of the nature of the debate, especially this morning, in which, essentially going from the growing consensus that Al-Qaeda, the terrorists, have been pushed to the periphery of things, the Maghreb, the Hindu Kush, where they've always been in these last 12 years, and in Yemen and the Arab Peninsula, that our own disastrous or misconceived military enterprises of the last decade, now winding down, needs to find a way to reconfigure itself to to deal with the rum. You know, it's interesting because it's, in a way, there's this cyclical behavior, I think, that we as Americans engage in, and that is to jump in sometimes with blindfolds on and all boots on, and then to recede completely from the scene. And so you see this kind of push-me-pull you debate taking place over drone warfare, lawful killing, and so on. And we do see both the efficacy of this sort of application of warfare to take care of the terrorist rum, but also the philosophical, moral, and the legal implications of it for down the road. I think that debate needs to continue to be very active. In the last 2 years, I've found myself moving on from Afghanistan and Iraq to places like Libya, Syria, and most recently Mali, which all have, you know, initially the Arab Spring, of course, seemed to be a positive phenomenon. It seemed to be divorced from our decade, the previous decade, the decade of confrontation with Al-Qaeda. But of course, there's always seepage from one decade to the other, and there's no doubt that we're dealing with a new kind of, in some cases it's a irredentist, extremist Islam that's finding new ways of purchase in political environments that breed what appear to be now chronic instability. We see Egypt, Libya. Each of these places has posed a different challenge to us as the U.S. with its fingers burnt. I'm speaking, you know, metaphorically here, in Afghanistan and Iraq. In Syria, I repeatedly get asked the questions by Americans involved in the security and policy establishment, what we should do and what we can do there. And to be honest, I'm not sure that there is much that we can do other than what we're doing, or that we should. The problem with having put a brand name on our behavior in the world 12 years ago with the global war on terror, however much we parse it and tweak it in the successive years, is that the perception is that we must have a hand in everything. It's interesting to see the various ways that this administration has chosen to respond to, first, the challenge in Libya, where it took a back seat to traditional allies, Britain and France, in what became a shooting war. But it was very much a remote control war. And yet, in the aftermath, there's very little, seemingly very little purchase on the environment in the intelligence sense. I think Benghazi showed us that. Mali, more recently, again, shows a kind of a behavior that's not entirely satisfactory, either by the U.S. or its allies, because, after all, however much they're derided as professional or not terrorists, you did have a series of groups, armed groups, extremist groups, that took over half of the country and sat there for 10 months. Not that far from Europe, in fact. Timbuktu's mosque was designed by a man from Granada, Spain, by the way, a few hundred years back. They've known about it ever since then. It's not that far, and yet we sat on our hands for 10 months. I was there recently. It was kind of interesting. For the first time, I saw that I went in with some French reinforcements to the front, and it was, this is anecdotal, but it was somehow a refreshing experience, because I wasn't around at the time, but it seemed like it must have been like this maybe in the early 60s for the Americans, possibly even going into Vietnam. They were in jeeps that weren't armored. They were pretty lightly armed. They were French Marines. They had trained with American Marines. They weren't, they were very much on the same page as we are in these environments. They spoke the language of the locals. And Candace, you mentioned this, the kind of linguistic deficit that we as a nation, as a powerful nation, continually display is, and are hampered by cannot be underestimated. It's serious. It's really serious. And I think it's part of a general attitude, or a general behavior in which we, as I said before, jump in and then recede from the world. If I had to just sum up what I believe to be taking place right now, is that we're seeing all kinds of eruptions in the Muslim world, which in many cases have been informed by the wars that took place in Afghanistan and Iraq, the kind of ongoing security behavior by America in that environment. We can't be, we can't live in ignorance of it. There are clearly environments that are highly geostrategic, like Syria, in which the United States, as a global superpower, is finding itself challenged by others. Russia is most clearly staking out a claim in Syria. The United States, if it wants to be part of that chess game, must muster some kind of response. It appears to be doing so mostly covertly. I can't necessarily fault that response. I was asked once who I would arm after a trip into Syria with the rebels, who I would give man-pads to. I met 4 or 5 people from 4 or 5 different groups, ranging from fairly extremist to the drug smuggling, co-optable, good old gangster types that often make up our paramilitaries. And I really I wouldn't want to give any one of them a man-pad. If I could handle it myself and come out again, fine. And I would say the jury's still out on that. I think there's some training going on. There's an effort to create some kind of autonomous cells. That's probably not a bad thing. My bottom line, I think that the U.S. needs to be, it's been uncertain. Its policies show its uncertainty. These debates show its uncertainty. It's not a bad thing that we are uncertain. We must also continue to be strong. The world looks to us, and in a way now more than ever. It's a much more chaotic and hostile world in many ways. But we need to calibrate our responses. And I think we need Mali, the kind of inaction in Mali, a real, a Tintin-esque little war in the middle of the Sahara. Well, that's the way Afghanistan was viewed back in the late 90s as well. I remember going around the world to a lot of the post-Cold War environments and writing about places where we had actually had a very big role after Vietnam, in those hot years of proxy conflict between us and the Soviet Union. And there were a lot of people out there thinking about us, thinking about our legacy, and we were living in ignorance of it. And I think we can't afford to live in ignorance of global perceptions of us and our behavior in the world anymore.
So listening to you describe these environments, one can't help but be struck by the disconnect between what we talked about this morning with this highly technological vision of drones and special operations forces and global strike and cyber, and the world that we see in Mali, Libya, Syria, and even to some extent Afghanistan today. How do we bridge that gap? And this is maybe for you and Doug and Dave in particular. How do we build the U.S. capability to act in these places when we seem so clearly invested in technological solutions and in high-end stuff, but we seem dragged into these, in many ways, very low-end but very timeless types of conflicts?
I'll start. This type of, we've learned a lot from Iraq and Afghanistan. The most important lesson to take away from Iraq and Afghanistan is exactly what Tommy said. We're not very good at this. We're better than we used to be, but we're still not very good at this. I think there's some clear steps that can be taken, linguistic capability being right at the top of the list, which might then generate a whole set of cascading effects like modesty and humility about our culture. Or one can dream of. Sensitivity to the other. I could go down this. But things that might make it, a little more pessimism, perhaps. all these things that might make us a little better at doing this. You know, I totally agree with almost everything John Lee has said, that in most occasions is the right thing for us to do in these situations is nothing or very little. My sole response to that is, you know, if we make a measured decision that we should not conduct a large-scale intervention in a country, I'm all about that. I don't want us to not have the option to do a large-scale intervention in a country. I think that, or, you know, we remain, you know, if not the hegemon, certainly the superpower. For us not to have that option on the table, I think, at this point in history, given the coming disorder that we clearly see throughout the entire Islamic world and elsewhere, it would be irresponsible.
I just had maybe a thought that, you know, this in a sense points out we have a bit of a strategy deficit as we look ahead. You know, again, looking back to this morning, you know, in talking about the high-end threats and the technology required and the requirements for drones and precision strike and very sophisticated analysis. Well, in a sense, that's got to be in service of a strategy, and I think we spent less time as a nation articulating what the strategy is, what the threat is. You know, the threats we're talking about here would have been viewed as incidental problems in the periphery in the 1990s, and they were right up until September 11, 2001. And in that one moment, we had them now move to the center of our security paradigm in a lot of ways. And yet we don't have a paradigm or a model taking us forward to think about, are we in a global containment of terrorism strategy, within which we're also going to be looking at nation-state threats and in other countries that could still fight nation-state versus nation-state. We have a whole there. What is that? How does that play out? It's not really GWAT 2.0. It's got to be something a little, I think, more thoughtful.
And so, Peter, I think you were one of the first to really write about Al-Qaeda, describe it. Well, Holy War Inc., I think, still is one of the first that I've read on the subject. You now pronounce them essentially as extinct. What's the next threat? What's the next Al-Qaeda-like threat, or is there something to be feared from associates of Al-Qaeda or associates of Al-Qaeda? What's next?
I think the answer is maybe nothing, you know, in terms of a serious threat. It might be uncomfortable. We're so used to trying to think of the world as a series of threats coming at us. And of course, you know, as Yogi Berra said, it's hard to make predictions, particularly about the future, and there will be other threats that come down the pike. But, you know, in the world that we actually live in, and the threat that I know something about, 17 Americans have been killed in this country by jihadist terrorists since 9/11. About 300 Americans die every year in their bathtubs accidentally. We don't have an irrational fear of accidental bathtub drownings, and we shouldn't have an irrational fear of Al-Qaeda and groups like it. Al-Qaeda hasn't had an attack in this country since 9/11. Al-Qaeda hasn't had an attack in the West since 2005. I mean, essentially, this is not a threat. I mean, if you think about the threats that are really threatening the United States, the Civil War, which almost destroyed this country, or Nazis who are going to take over Europe and destroy Western civilization, or the Cold War, I mean, these are sort of non-issues. And, you know, so I'm deliciously unconcerned about future threats, but then perhaps I'm just poorly informed about what form they might take.
I doubt that, but we want to open up to questions with the remainder of our time. Wait for the mic to come around, and yes, sir, in the front. Just coming down the aisle to you.
I guess for Mr. Bergen and General Barno, how would you define Al-Qaeda? Is it, at its heart, is it a military force, or is it a philosophy?
Well, if it's a philosophy, it's doing pretty poorly, and if it's a military force, it's practically been destroyed. So, you know, on either definition, it's not doing particularly well. If you look at polling data around the Muslim world, support for these ideas is close to zero, and there's a good reason for that. You know, Al-Qaeda is offering no ideas for the real political and economic problems that exist in the Muslim world. And I say Al-Qaeda groups like it as well. You know, what they're offering is Taliban-style theocracies from Indonesia to Morocco. Those people don't want to live under the Taliban. And you know, John Lee was in Mali. You know, the French were greeted as an army of liberation in Mali, which was part of their, relatively recently, part of their empire. You know, that's because the jihadi militants did there exactly what they do every time. Taliban-style rule, amputations of hands, banning music and dancing in a country where these are widely celebrated. And it's encoded in the DNA of these groups to make their own set of these same very self-destructive errors. The one huge caveat is what we're seeing in Syria, where they seem to have learned from their mistakes. And Al-Nusra is not imposing this kind of rule on the population for the moment. So whether it's an ideology or a military force or some combination of both, generally speaking, there are just very few takers for it, which is why the threat is very low from these groups. Unless you happen to live in Syria right now in an area dominated by it.
The only thing I would add to that is I do think it is an ideology and a military capability. And the thing that makes it perhaps most noteworthy to us is it's not going to be exterminated. I think it has shown a tremendous amount of resilience, adaptability. It's morphed into different things, and some of the ideological components of it, even if there are just small numbers of adherents in these countries, have a catalytic effect on other disaffected groups there. So it's going to be, I think, even in its much diminished versions, a problem for the United States for many years to come, in my sense. Thank you.
Yes, sir, behind you in the group.
David Barno, your three criteria for evaluating the results of what's happening, excuse me, the results in Afghanistan, none of them refer to the conditions in Afghanistan itself, social or political. This suggests that the efforts of nation building, that you're writing off the efforts of nation building, that you think they don't matter, and given your expectations that I think are realistic about the relatively low commitment to U.S. assistance to Afghanistan in the future, it's hard to believe that this country is going to find stability or, certainly a successful democracy. I'd just like to ask you a comment. Have you just given up on that?
No, I haven't. And I think Peter and I agree quite a bit on this in the sense of Afghanistan is more than the sum of the American effort in Afghanistan for the last 10 years. We tend to look at it through the lens of how much money we've spent, how many projects we've done, how well did they do. Afghanistan existed before those projects were there and before the American forces were there, and there are mighty numbers of 400 in 2001. And will be after whatever transition happens in 2014. And I actually think that the country will be, I think, again, I would agree with Peter's assessment here, the country will be, in my judgment at least, in far better places in January of 2015 than it was in October or September of 2001 by an order of magnitude. And I think virtually every Afghan would say that as well, even after 10 years of not particularly successful American activities in Afghanistan. So I think there's actually a fairly strong country there. It's certainly riven by factionalism, has been since its formation, which was before our formation as a nation, has never split apart as a country despite having 5+ very fractious ethnic group that have comprised what it means to be Afghan. So I'm actually fairly optimistic the country is not going to fragment. I think what road it takes, in part determine upon what degree of continued commitment it has from the West, is hard to predict though right now.
Candace, you spent an extraordinary amount of time there. How do you define success, or how do you define a positive outcome, or outcomes generally in Afghanistan?
Well, I think the best success for any country is the assertions of its sovereignty. And at this stage, you really can't say that Afghanistan is in a position to assert its sovereignty. And that's what we're seeing now with Karzai's seemingly erratic statements about the relationship between the U.S. and Taliban and collusion and so forth. But what he is tapping into there is a very profound sense that dates back to certainly 1973, that the presence, influence of outside powers, be they regional or otherwise, is something that is extremely destabilizing for the social fabric of the country. And, you can look at Barno, the prison at Barno, as one of the best examples of sort of a long line of detention, disappearance, use of power, that stretches back to the 1960s even. And what the Afghans see, I think, is that line. And that's what the U.S. has failed to see, is that in fact there is a continuity between this idea that an outside power, be it Pakistan, be it Russia, be it the United States, can come in and start dictating the terms of rule of law, whatever that may be. It can be defined one way, in 1973, and another way today. Without a sort of consensus around that inside Afghanistan itself, which there never really has been. Right? There's always been this dichotomy between Sharia and traditional, so-called informal law, and then, of course, what we know as civil law. And these contradictions really have rent the entire society, right? And then to come in and disappear thousands of people into a system that nobody fully understands or can access, that is extremely destabilizing. So, I mean, success, I think, will look like, frankly, no U.S. presence at all in Afghanistan, where you'll have the main political institutions, parliament, judiciary, the executive, working together to really guarantee that they agree on the basic principles of what it means to have justice in the country. You cannot have this with 60,000 troops from outside. You cannot have this when people are thrown into places like Bagram with little or no explanation. You cannot have this when a constitutional commission that the U.S. has been trying to build up with various amounts of money and rule of law programming still insists, in fact, on the unconstitutionality of administrative internment, and yet nobody listens to them. Right? So, I mean, the prospects for Afghanistan in terms of stabilization and/or success really lie through the road of withdrawal complete. There's no other way around it.
Isn't there a caveat to that, though? For instance, if the Obama administration says, and I think the numbers, whether it's 6,000 or 10,000, is less important than saying, hey, it's a long-term commitment. I mean, this is something the Afghan parliament will have to vote on, right? In which case it would be...
Ostensibly, the Afghan parliament should vote on a lot of things. Yeah. Usually what happens is Karzai gets, in his head, he wants to have some sort of mini jirga. I mean, this is a throwback. I mean, people have been doing this, Afghan rulers have been doing this since the 70s, throwing together jirgas in order to legitimate processes that they actually don't want to have discussed or debated publicly in any real form. I mean, Karzai is about cutting off conversation. And I think the constitutional system that we handed them, vis-a-vis our interference, was all about cutting off conversation and public debate and public participation in these very important policy issues of what happens to your children when they get arrested, what happens to your children when somebody kicks down the door at night, or your wife. I mean, these are questions that really are so core and fundamental. We would never stand for something like this in our own country, right? And yet we cannot somehow get our heads around the idea that there's something not even, you can't even categorize it as offensive. It's beyond offensive.
So let me push you on this and also invite Doug and Johnny to comment. So Afghanistan's long in the playing field for the great game. What happens if or when the U.S. pulls out completely? Who are the powers that then play on this field? What are the interests that then fill the vacuum that we leave behind?
Well, I mean, I think Iran and India and Russia are certainly making themselves known. And I think their investment, certainly in the political process vis-a-vis the elections, is very obvious and evident. And we're going to see that play out. And I think what will be interesting is because there's so much focus on the presidential elections, and you often forget there's also a provincial council election that's going to go on in each of the 34 provinces. And that's just going to be a big mathematical catastrophe, where you might have a situation where you get one political candidate that the mafia groups agree on, the political elites agree on, the businessmen agree on for the presidency. But I can tell you that for some 2,000 seats in provincial councils, it's not going to happen. And so you're going to have a long period of contested election results, and that's where things start to fall apart. That's the greatest danger. So in terms of the outside powers, what happens will be determined by how much Iran has invested, say, in predominantly Shia groups or predominantly Uzbek groups. I mean, those relationships are very critical to understanding what will happen down the line, I think.
Yes, sir, in the red sweatshirt.
In Afghanistan, I planned operations in Afghanistan, and it seemed like the hardest thing to deal with in Afghanistan was
Can you use the mic?
The hardest thing to deal with in Afghanistan was the vertical information structure in the military. Routinely, we were having the battle handed to us on the information side, and that we couldn't reach down and grab the information, and it didn't come up fast enough. So before we knew it, Karzai was sending out press releases in Kabul about stuff that happened within our AO that we had no clue about, and then we would actually be sitting in our office planning operations, and we would watch CNN, and we would see stuff that was happening. That was our best way of getting information, and I guess another thing to do with the information was that we didn't always know what the interests were that we were fighting there in Helmand province, which is where I was. So has anybody addressed the vertical information structure and possibly changing that so that we're a little bit more adaptable to these kind of conflicts?
Doug, I think you and John Lee have seen this abroad, particularly in places like the Arab Spring, with the fact that security forces typically aren't inside the Twitter cycle and aren't inside the news cycle. What do you think?
Well, it's particularly difficult for the U.S. military, which has two barriers. One, a physical one, usually of dirt and rocks and gates that keep them from the local people. And then second, of course, a language barrier that even if they could, in theory, physically interact with them, they couldn't understand what they were saying anyway. So, yeah, a huge barrier. And of course, Karzai speaks Pashto. He can talk to people. And so do his people. So this should not surprise us, and we should just expect that anytime you go someplace, unless we're fortunate enough to do counterinsurgency in Australia or something, that they're going to be operating in their native language, and they're going to understand the cultures and the metaphors and the history and the stories that this will resonate with, and they're always going to work to think that we can work the information cycle better than the locals can is technological silliness.
I just wanted to add an anecdote picking up on your comment. I spent a few weeks embedded in the South Kandahar, Maiwand way, in late 2010 at a COP, which I don't know what the price tag on that place was. It was expensive. It was about 400 men there. They had been there 3 months, and while I was there, they decided to venture out into the nearby community, which they had never, ever entered before. And we entered it in those 17-ton sort of space vehicles. The Taliban were gone, of course. There was a few IDs, but it was just an extraordinary. I felt like a Martian, with a group of other aliens in landing craft going out on the surface. And that same week, we went to a nearby town where the colonel, who was a good military guy. He had a very poor mission, an unwinnable task. Had what he called his security shura, a kind of council where the elders come in this case, from Taliban-held villages and so forth. And he had his local counterparts, the local police chief, an ostensible ally, and another man who, in the course of this 3-hour meeting, I never knew who he was, but he clearly had great ascendancy over everyone Afghan in the room. And I made a little remark to myself that if there was a Taliban official in the room, it was this man. It turned out to be the NDS official, the National Security Directorate official. But the colonel actually came the day later and came and said, "What did I think of the meeting? What did I think of that guy?" I said, "Why do you ask?" He said, I just wanted to know what you thought. And I said, "Well, I thought he was very possibly, a Taliban official." I said, "What do you know about him?" He said, "Nothing." I said, "What do you mean you know nothing about him?" "You took over 3 months or 6 months ago, and the time before you had it for a year, and they dealt with him too, didn't they?" I said, "Yes." "So when you took over, did they give you any information about him?" "Nothing, not a thing." That was his security ally. And of course, this was all something that was imposed on him. He was doing the best he could in a poor situation, but I felt very much that I was witnessing a kind of an army that was straitjacketed and rule-bound in all the wrong ways. and that could no longer be resourceful and innovative. And it was then, in fact, that I also began to probe why it was that there was no interaction with the locals, there was no language at all. And I was reassured by a young officer that, in fact, the newcomers were going to have to speak a minimum of 60 words of either Pashto or Dari, depending on where they were sent. This was in, November 2010, a little bit late in the game.
So that's 9 years into the war effort, and I think that illustrates the proverb that we haven't been in Afghanistan 12 years, we've been there 1 year 12 times.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Can I comment on that? I think as we look back on this war 10 years from now, as we really dig into it, I think one of the most glaring failures that we will find is this one. Since 2001, we've had 11 different overall U.S. military commanders. I was one of those, one of 11 in a 12-year period of time, and we've had 7 different U.S. ambassadors, as well as a few chargés thrown in for a couple months on either ends of gaps when we had no ambassador. No university could survive that kind of turnover. No business could survive and remain afloat with that kind of leadership turnover. We've done it in a war where people are trying to kill you and make you fail both. That is unconscionable. The results, I think, in some ways, are directly attributable in a lot of respects to that.
We have time for Deb.
Thanks for a really interesting panel. I guess my question, maybe for General Barno, but really any of the panelists, how do we think about the role of the military in our coming age of disorder, right, or our current age of disorder? How do we think about the role of the military as opposed to other instruments of national power, not just intelligence community, of course, but the State Department and economic means and so forth? What role can, should, and this is going to be unfair, but don't start with a financial answer, right? I mean, I understand that's at the top of the news right now, as well it should be, but if you were designing your ideal structure for dealing with every time we have a meltdown in Mali or Syria or the next one, what does this look like? And again, for any of you.
Yeah, just some brief thoughts. One is that we have talked almost exclusively today about the military being in some kind of offensive role, whether it's drone strikes or cyber warfare or counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, Iraq. I think we're moving to an era where we're still going to have a large, expensive military, and particularly for the ground forces, Army, Marines, and special operators. They've got a much bigger role potentially to play in conflict prevention around the world than in simply, being the fire extinguisher behind the glass that gets broken when the war starts. It's a big investment to only get conflict capabilities, to get war fighting capabilities out of this military. So we ought to be thinking creatively about ways to use those well-digger teams, those engineers, those civil affairs specialists. The people have learned so much in this last 10 years in some ways to help us under Chief of Mission Authority in our embassies, trying to do things to supplement the State Department, not in service of and working for the State Department in various parts of the world, whether it's Africa, Asia, etc. The Army is wrestling with this. It doesn't have any force structure devoted to this. It's kind of fighting the idea that it should be doing this on a large scale. They're doing a little bit of it, but there's a very strong tendency to be the axe behind the glass and not be something useful to make sure the fires don't start in the first place.
I think we're at a difficult place in trying to balance these now for a couple of reasons. I mean, the military, I think, has clearly become the elite bureaucracy of the United States. I don't think that's a controversial statement anymore. It's got all the money. It invests in its people. They've got graduate degrees. We maintain, 5 different war colleges to send people to. We send people off to Stanford and Harvard and fellowships. And then the military runs the COCOMs, which are the de facto instruments of U.S. policy throughout the world. The State Department is A, starved, and B, continues to use this foreign service exam, which, to get, the right people into the State Department, meaning people who think just like us, the current State Department NSOs. And it's starved for resources. So I can think of ways in which state could be fixed with the right money and with someone who is willing to make some pretty violent personnel policy changes inside that institution. USAID just has to be brought down to the ground and brought back. It's so starved that it can't be fixed, I don't think. And again, it's not that there are some wonderful people working inside USA. It's not their fault. It's an institution that was starved, and because of that, I don't see any way in which it's generated.
We have time for one more, sir, in the brown suit.
John Lee talks about a world of increasing disorder where we might see Rwandas and Srebrenitsas again in the future. And my question, kind of tying the day together, is to what extent has it been thought that drones might be used for humanitarian intervention or responsibility to protect interventions, even if you could meet the just war principles of R2P and you had an intervention that was efficacious? We have a problem with lack of will, lack of contributing countries. And the question for the military experts is to what extent has the United States considered the use of drones for certain humanitarian interventions, presumably or ideally with UN mandate, Brave New World, where you tell President al-Bashir or President Assad, you do this, or you face drone strikes in your country. What kind of planning is there for this?
I don't think I've ever heard the words drone, humanitarian, and UN mandate used. So, it sounds wonderful. I don't want to go that far. It sounds like something we should very strongly look at and consider in the right situation.
Yeah, militarily, if you had any humanitarian assistance effort, another Haiti, another, even something like the tsunami relief effort in Asia, would almost inevitably involve drones doing surveillance, providing video. I mean, just like we would use manned aircraft to look at disaster sites and assess what's there. In the future, that's going to be an inherent part of how the military operates anywhere in the world, with the permission of the countries involved. But you won't see a military operation, I suspect, in the future that will not involve drones, even if it's a benign military operation.
Okay, I think we're pretty much going to call it a day. I'm going to have a few reflections on today. There are some very interesting comparisons that came up, and everybody's trying to grasp for a precedent, a metaphor. But the one that kept coming up were things tied to Russia, particularly this morning. It was perestroika, it was the redone photograph. Someone brought up the American Spring. I'm not sure where we could go with that if I told everybody they had a familiar metaphor, but it surprised me. We've covered a lot of territory today, from politics to money, not that they're separable, from the rule of law to the vested interests of business, from the visible to the invisible enemy, from the cyber enemy to the enemy in Afghanistan. And basically, I think I don't know what your takeaways from today are, but as I know you're all going to write me and tell me anyway. So my takeaways from today are that, in a way, we have much more clarity on some of these issues than I actually thought we had before. That the idea that drones are easier, that they're more convenient, is something that we accept. Didn't seem to have much debate there. Whether or not we want to use them in this way is another issue. The idea that the United States seems to be very good at some things and not very good at another things seems to be not something that is coming along partisan lines. Maybe we can help Afghanistan in certain ways. Maybe it's time to pull out. I'm not really sure. The takeaway for me from the day, however, is quite different. And I encourage those of you who are here from the afternoon to go back and look at the discussions on the authorization to use military force. Because the one issue that nobody seemed to really raise today was, are we at war? And if we are, what kind of war we're at? And that may seem like a glib question, but it's not. We have a president who came into power and accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, by saying, we need war. War is a necessary tool to peace. And he talked about just war, but he wasn't willing to back away from the notion. And I haven't heard really anybody today saying, we're safe enough, it's okay, maybe we don't need to be at war. I've heard a lot of people talk about how we define the enemy, which I know was the premise of the conference, or how we define the battlefield. But what I didn't really hear today, even from Jay Johnson, who had introduced the notion of peace at his Oxford Union speech, was anybody talking about how we get, not just to getting out of Afghanistan or fixing this or fixing that, or figuring out our cyber lines between espionage and war, but how we ever get to peace. And so the question I leave you with, and it's always my job to leave people in a good mood, so this is my way of leaving you a good question. The question I want to leave you with is, what about peace? Any chance that we could get there sometime in the near future? And that may sound a little idealistic, but somebody needed to say it, so it was me. So thank you very much. Thank our panelists, and thank you for being here.